This is our third video dealing with race and ethnicity. Let's start out with our learning objectives. In this video, we're going to look at two of the 5 main racial classifications that we use here in the United States. We're going to be looking at Native Americans and African Americans. And in both cases, we're going to look at their contemporary geography. What is the geography of Native Americans in the United States? What's the geography of African Americans in the United States? And then secondly, we're going to move on and we're going to briefly describe some of the historical forces that have produced or shaped these particular geographies. So why don't we begin by looking at Native Americans. This map right here shows the geography of Native Americans in the United States in the year 2000. So it might seem a little out of date, but trust me, in the 12 years that have passed since the year 2000, this pattern has stayed relatively fixed and stable. Let's start over here in the legend. It's a little hard to see, I realize, but I want to point out this information right here. It says that in the United States in the year 2000, just under 1% of the entire population identified as Native American. That exact number is 0.9%, but I think for purposes of simplicity, we'll just round that up to 1%. So 1 out of every 100 Americans in the year 2000 identified as Native American. Now, I suppose an interesting point that we need to emphasize right away is if we were to go back in time, let's say, well, I don't know, 500 years to the year 1500, quite obviously at that time in history, everyone who lived in what would one day become the United States was Native American. So this represents a big change. And all of this, of course, can be linked back to European colonialism and a variety of other forces that have shaped the North American continent both politically and culturally over the course of the last 500 years. Now, the other thing about the legend I want to focus on is any of these colors represent areas where there is a disproportionately large concentration of Native Americans, so above the national average of 1%. And in my view, it looks like 3 areas really stand out. Let's talk about those 3, and then we'll move on to an explanation for why these 3 actually have at least one thing in common. The first place that really stands out to me is the entire state of Oklahoma, especially if you contrast Oklahoma to states nearby, like Texas, Arkansas, or Kansas. Oklahoma looks, at first glance especially, to be a disproportionately large concentration of people who identified as Native American. The second region that stands out is over here, just to the west, in the American Southwest. The generic term that we might use to describe that area is the Four Corners. It's called that because it's the only part of the United States where 4 states come together at one point. So you might call it Four Corners, or I suppose another term that you could use to describe this area is it's the American Southwest. It includes northern Arizona, northern New Mexico, and parts of adjacent states like Colorado and Utah. Then finally, there is a third regional constellation of counties that seem to have a really high share of Native Americans, basically representing the area that I'm indicating here with the cursor. And I suppose that's a somewhat more difficult region to name, but I would call it the Northern Great Plains. Places like Dakota, but especially as well South Dakota and parts of Montana. So 3 regions really stand out, and I suppose if we wanted to be thorough, we might also add the entire state of Alaska. Those are the areas that, if you look at the contemporary geography of Native Americans, stand out as quite literally holding the lion's share of the population in the United States that identifies as Native American. The question, of course, becomes why? Why these areas? Well, it has to do with the history of the relationship between Native Americans and the American government. Most of you probably are already familiar with what happened to Native Americans in the 19th century. A policy of Indian removal and displacement essentially pushed almost all of the Native Americans who once lived here in the eastern one half of the United States in a westerly direction to places like South Dakota, Oklahoma, and the far southwest. These were the places where the government at the time, the American government at the time, had established Indian reservations. So this policy of segregating, removing, and displacing Native Americans has had a really dramatic effect on the contemporary geography. To give you just one example of this, the entire state of Oklahoma at one time in our history was labeled on the map as Indian country. It was planned to become a huge, large, extensive Native American reservation. But later on in the late 19th century, our government reneged on that promise and instead opened the area to what they called at the time white settlement. And so the result is that Native American and white culture mixed in states like Oklahoma. Now, I want to give you just one example, just one, of this westward displacement of the Native American population that occurred in the 19th century. And I want to use Wisconsin. The first of the Native American cultures or nations to be removed and displaced from Wisconsin was the Ho-Chunk. On this map right here, the area outlined in pink in southern Wisconsin represents the area where the Ho-Chunk culture lived. That would have been basically the equivalent of their country or their state. And if you follow the arrows that are represented, what you see is this. At first, there was a displacement, a removal of the Ho-Chunk nation into Iowa. Eventually, a second stage in that removal pushed the Ho-Chunk all the way up to northern Minnesota by the time we get to the middle part of the 19th century. And ultimately, the Ho-Chunk were pushed all the way to South Dakota. So those Indians, those Native Americans that you see in South Dakota today, many of them have their ancestry here in the state of Wisconsin. And what happened here with regard to the Ho-Chunk was reproduced 100, if not a few hundred times over the course of the entire 18th and 19th centuries, thus producing that geography that we see today. And that leads me to one final point. Why those particular areas? Why Oklahoma? Why the American Southwest? Why the Northern Great Plains? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the land in those areas was not desired by incoming European settlers. It was hard to farm, it was remote, and it was isolated. So basically the least capable land was handed over to the Native Americans. Let's move on to African Americans. This is an equivalent map only showing the geography of African Americans again in the year 2000. Let's start as we did when we discussed Native Americans with the overall percent. The African American percentage of the total United States population in the year 2000 was about 12.3%. That number has gone up marginally to just under 13% in the year 2010. But the geography has remained relatively similar. It's basically fixed, as was the case with Native Americans, because not much can change with regard to geography in less than a generation's time. There is a distinct geography with respect to African Americans, and what stands out immediately is the American Southeast. So an arc of territory that runs from the Mississippi Delta region, which means Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana, through the heart of Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, and then eventually terminating here in the Washington, D.C. area, an area that sometimes is well called the Chesapeake Bay region. Now, the one thing on this map that's somewhat more difficult to see is those areas that have a great concentration of African Americans in some of the larger cities, especially in the north. So just to give an example, it's kind of hard to pick out, but this is Cook County, Illinois. Cook County, Illinois has well over 5 million people, which means it's more populous than really any of the southeastern states except for maybe Georgia. And so what this map kind of doesn't reveal is how important places like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and New York City are to the geography of African Americans, in part because those counties are geographically small, but they're very populous. So well over 45 to 50% of the total African American population in the United States lives in those big city counties, especially in the northern tier of states, but also in some of those southern states as well. Now, most of us are already familiar with the historical forces that have produced this particular geography. It has to do primarily with the geography of the plantation economy in pre-Civil War America, the part of the United States where the agricultural system was rooted in the slave economy. Now, not all African Americans have connections to the slave economy, just a majority do. And so you need to be careful here to make sure that you're not suggesting that every person in the United States who is of African heritage has a historical connection to the slave economy, but the majority do. And especially when you look at this particular map here in the American Southeast, those are the areas that corresponded to the development of a plantation economy in pre-Civil War America. Let's just look very briefly at a geography of the slave trade that had developed during these years. The slave trade, of course, was based in something called the Atlantic Mercantilist Circuit. You don't necessarily need to know that, but it was a large-scale trading network that had been initiated by the West European colonial powers way back in the 1600s, and it lasted well into the 19th century, basically coming to a close with the very end of slavery in America with the 1860s. It brought together, in particular, West Africa, which would have been the source area for the overwhelming majority of slaves that were brought to the Americas. In particular, places like Brazil, where about 5 million slaves had been extracted from West Africa. The West Indies, where just under 5 million slaves had also been extracted from West Africa, but also the southeastern part of the United States, which, as you can see, was also connected to this mercantilist circuit that had developed primarily through the West European powers in the Atlantic Basin over the course of a few hundred years between 1650 and about 1860. Now, although the slave trade is certainly important in terms of determining the geography of African Americans in the United States, there's actually something else that's even more important. And what that is something called the Great Migration. What this refers to is the largest internal regional shift that has occurred in American history on behalf of one particular group. And that would be African Americans who in the 20th century abandoned the rural South and traveled to the northern cities in particular in search of economic opportunity, political opportunity, and cultural opportunity. So the catalyst year is 1916, which is important. It corresponds to the beginnings of World War I, when I can imagine most of you would probably take a guess that the northern industrial cities had really vibrant economies and a lot of economic opportunity. So that's one of the pull factors that brought African Americans to the rural north. The Great Migration lasts well beyond 1930, in fact. It goes all the way to about the 1970s, when it became clear that economic opportunity in those northern industrial cities was no longer as high as it had been in previous decades. So then, what accounts for that large concentration of African Americans in some of those northern cities like Chicago, which was once literally called the Promised Land for African Americans, and places like Cleveland, Detroit, and New York, is this very important internal, intra-regional migration stream, which shaped the American economy, geography, and culture over the course of the 20th century. One final note: just like other Americans, African Americans have begun to return to the South over the course of about the last 15 years. And so, just to give one example, many college-educated African Americans in the Chicago metropolitan area have been leaving that particular part of the Midwest and going to the new magnet city, which is Atlanta. In fact, Atlanta has become, in a way, the new promised land, if you will, for African Americans in the United States in our new economy of the early 21st century.